Well, it's my task to introduce you briefly to the writings of the intertestamental period, and the original schedule had me doing that today. It isn't going to get finished today, but we'll get started on it today. But before we start, I think it would be good for us to review the history that we've looked at the last couple of weeks. Unless you remember all the details from last week. You got all that down? I didn't think so. It's pretty hard to remember all those details. So let's go over it again, and maybe without all the details, and remind you that in the book of Daniel, in chapter 7, we're told of the course of empire to come in what the New Testament calls the oikoumene. Okay, that word is probably down here somewhere. Maybe it's not. I'll write it up here. oikoumene. Sometimes your Bible will translate that the inhabited earth. Sometimes it'll translate it world, which is very confusing because there's another word in the New Testament that means world. It's the word cosmos. The oikoumene is the empire that God sets up in Daniel. It lasts from Nebuchadnezzar until AD 70, and that's the end of it. Okay, the Roman Empire continues on, but it's no longer God's special land. And this special history has 4 periods. There are 4 great living creatures in Daniel chapter 7. And the first of them is like a lion, and that represents Babylon. The second is like a bear, which represents Persia. The third is like a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. And these 4 heads are 4 new beginnings of the Greek Empire. The word head in the Bible means initiation or beginning. The husband is the head of the wife. That means he initiates things. He's also the boss, but being the head doesn't mean being the boss. It means the one who starts things. And then the fourth of these beasts is Rome. And so here we have it. If you look at your page, the first phase of it is the Babylonian captivity. And what's going to be important for us today is to understand that although a lot of the Jews went to Babylon, a lot of them ran down to Egypt and they dragged Jeremiah down there. And so there were a lot of Jews in Egypt from this time forth, and a lot of intertestamental books were written by Jews in Egypt. And a lot of things happened down in Egypt during the next 400 or 500 years. And so we want to remember that. Some Jews went to Babylon, others ran away and went to Egypt, and they dragged Jeremiah down there with them. 50 years after this event, 70 years after Daniel himself went into captivity, God brings in the second of these empires, which is the Persian Empire under Cyrus. And Cyrus is the first of the Messianic anointed kings. We looked at that in Esther, but just as David and his line were anointed kings to be respected, as David respected Saul, the Lord's anointed, so now we have another line of anointed kings over the oikoumene, starting with Cyrus and ending with who? Who was the last of the line of anointed kings? Does anybody know? Vespasian, okay? The 9th Roman emperor, the 10th horn on the Roman head. He is the emperor, the anointed messianic ruler at the time that Jerusalem falls. And after that, that's the end of that. You just have emperors after that, not anointed ones. Okay. So for a while, Israel is under Persia, and that's for a couple of centuries. And then we have the invasion of Alexander the Great. Remember, the Persians kept trying to attack the Greeks. Darius had done so, Xerxes had done so, and the Greeks were all divided up into these tribes. These tribes had grown up to become city-states, but they were still tribes. And they all fought with each other, and they couldn't cooperate. And after the Persians kept moving in, the Greeks looked at the Persian Empire and said, we'd like to have one of those. Of course, the Spartans said, we'd like to have one. And the Corinthians said, we'd like to have one. And the Athenians said, we'd like to have one. So they started fighting among themselves, and eventually they began to conquer each other. And finally, Philip of Macedon conquered and unified Greece to be like the Persians and also to protect them from the Persians. They've been worried about the Persians for about 100 years, so now they're ready. And he raised up his son Alexander to go over and clean the clock of the Persians so they won't bother us anymore, kind of like, the Americans going and preemptively getting rid of Iraq before Iraq can cause trouble. Well, let's go get rid of Persia before Persia can cause any more trouble. Of course, the Persians were real decadent and weak by this time, and they weren't a real threat. So it was easy for Alexander to conquer them. He is the beginning of the Greek or Hellenistic beast. Okay, the third beast of Daniel. And he's the first head on that beast. Well, he doesn't last very long. And the next head of this beast is Greek Egypt. You have to kind of remember a map here. Here is our basic map. And here's Egypt down here. And here is Greek Syria up here. And here is what is now called the Holy Land. Okay. It's not the land of promise. That was in Abraham's day. It's not the land of milk and honey. That's over and done with. That ended in the destruction of Jerusalem in the days of Jeremiah. No, this is now called the Holy Land. This is an entirely new plot of land. The promises made to Abraham were finished when the Jews went back to Babylon. Abraham left Babylon. He went to the land. They went down to Egypt. They came back to the land. They went back to Babylon. That's the end of that. You know, nowadays you hear dispensationalists say, well, there's still a promise of the land. God promised the land to Abraham. That promise was over when the Jews went back to Babylon. They went back to Ur of the Chaldees. That was the end of that. Now we start a new history. We come back. This is called the Holy Land. It has different dimensions. The Bible tells us it's much smaller. It only goes here to the edge of the land. Originally, the land promised to Abraham was all this. Not anymore. That's finished. That history is over and done with. Now we have the Holy Land right here. Galilee, Samaria, and Judea when we get to the New Testament. That's all. That's the Holy Land. And inside of it is the Holy City. It's not the city of David anymore. It's the Holy City. This is all new. This is new language that shows up at this time in history in the text of the Bible. So we have a new land, and new Abraham's coming with Ezra back in here and starting up a new history. And initially, we're in Egypt. It's the Egyptians who are running this area here under the Ptolemies. Ptolemy. In Greek, you would have said Ptolemaeus, but now we say Ptolemy because we don't want to have to say at the beginning of it for some reason. Okay, they're in charge right at the beginning here after Alex dies. Now, Ptolemy had a general, and his general was named Seleucus, or Seleucus, Seleucus, his general, and he said, General Seleucus, why don't you go on up here and have your headquarters up in Syria? So he does. He goes up to Syria, and after a few years, he kind of makes his own little empire up here. And they get along okay, but then after a while, they don't get along okay, and they start fighting. Daniel chapter 11 describes all these wars between the North and the South, between the Yankees and the Confederates, the Egyptians who have slaves, you see down here in the South, and the Yankees up here in Greek Syria, who also have slaves. All right. Now, after a while, the Jews are delivered from Egypt. There's a new exodus, and the Syrians take over this area under a king named Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great. Antiochus. He's something of a hero. We're told that he restored the temple and did all these nice things for the Jews. Well, about this time in history, the priests, who are the aristocratic rulers in Jerusalem, because in this new covenant situation, the priests are in charge of the commonwealth. Along with the wealthy people in Jerusalem, they decide to remake Jerusalem into a Greek city. They apostatize from the Lord, and they decide to remake the city. And at this time, they kick out the true high priest, who was supposed to be from the line of Zadok. His name was Onias III. They kick him out, and then a few years later, they kill him. And God answers this by bringing in an oppression by the next by one of these Greek kings whose name is Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes had his own agenda, and part of his agenda was to make sure the Jews were loyal servants of his, and since there were continual civil wars going down in here, Antiochus came in and settled the civil wars by imposing his own religion on the people. Well, that led to a revolt, and the people in Jerusalem didn't mind it particularly because they'd already apostatized, but the believers out here in Judah, okay, you've got Jerusalem and the clans of Judah. That's the way it's written in this part of the Bible. The people out in the clans of Judah were conservative, and they didn't want this Greek stuff. And so there was a local priest, not a Zadokite, not of the high priestly line, but a local priest descended from Aaron, named Hasmonean. That was the family name. Mattathias Hasmonean. Very important name. Because Mattathias Hasmonean refused to go along with the apostasy of the Jews, and then he refused to go along with Antiochus Epiphanes' attempt to change the whole religion of the area, or to change it somewhat. And so he wound up leading a revolt. He and his 5 sons. One of his sons was so effective in combat that he was called the Hammer. His name was Judas, and he became known as Judas Maccabeus. Maccabee is hammer. You can hear the hammer in there. Bum, bum, ba bum, bum, ba-da-da-da-dum, bum, bum. That's from Judas Maccabeus by Handel, okay? You've heard that song before. It may even be in some of the hymnals with different words. All right, so they deliver Israel as the result of a guerrilla warfare from the oppression of the Syrian kings up here. The Syrian kings continue to have influence, but not much. So now what would you expect? These righteous Jews, led by the house of Hasmonean, they're going to go over and they're going to get the son of Onias III, Onias IV, who is the true high priest. And they'll bring him back to Jerusalem, and they'll put him in the temple, and they'll restore the temple. No, you know what? They decided that they didn't want to do that. They decided that the high priesthood looked pretty good. In fact, being in charge felt real good. You know, when you've gone out and you've fought some battles and you've been a military hero, it's no fun to go back and just plant wheat. We discovered that in Vietnam. You had all these young men who went out and fought the French with all their guns, and they got to roam around the countryside in the mid-1950s and kill French and deliver Vietnam from French domination. They got to roam around and have guns, rape all the girls. You know, it's a lot of fun. Then it was time, it was over, the French were gone, they had to go back and plant rice. Well, that didn't look very much fun, you know. Who wants to go back and do that? So they became the Viet Cong, and Ho Chi Minh said, well, why don't you fight some Americans? So then we had to deal with them. Well, who wants to go back to planting wheat after you've been a great military leader? Much more fun to take everything over. So the Hasmoneans, Hasmonean, they made themselves the high priests and kings over the Holy Land. It was a usurpation. First of all, they weren't supposed to be kings. They weren't supposed to call themselves kings. The kings were supposed to be the anointed rulers of the Oikomen. Antiochus was gone, and the new Syrian kings weren't going to bother them, but they made themselves independent and set up their own kingship, and they stole a high priesthood. This is important. There is no more true high priest in Israel from this point. Never. Till Jesus comes. No high priest, no annual Day of Atonement. Sins are not taken care of every year. Sins are piling up year after year because there's no Day of Atonement to take care of them. Well, you know, we're still a small country here with all these big nations round about, so senatorial Rome is becoming a power in the Mediterranean by this point. Senatorial Rome tells all the nations, hey, leave the Jews alone. They extend protection over them. And this coming under senatorial Rome is Daniel's 4th Greek head now, the last of the Greek heads, senatorial or republican Rome. During this period, we have the gradual development of 3 parties, 2 of which are of importance to us. First of all, the Sadducees. These people who had let the city of Jerusalem go into apostasy, they kind of went underground, but they were still wealthy, aristocratic, priestly people in the city. And just like in the United States today, when people get rich, they get liberal. Okay? The rich people in America are all on the left, because left-wing politics is basically, if you scratch underneath it, a defense of aristocracy against the middle class. And so this is the upper class group of people. They were often compromised with Greek ideas and usually in favor with the Hasmonean kings. Then you had the Pharisees. That's not what they were called originally. They were called the righteous. Then they were called the associates, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. These are the faithful believers who are not going along with Greek thought. They tend to be your middle class and lower class people. And then you had another group of people, which we call Essenes, who were dropouts. They were like Anabaptists. They said, we're not going to have anything to do with anybody who'll go out in the wilderness and live, because the temple is defiled and it hasn't been fixed, and so we won't have anything to do with the temple. They don't show up in the New Testament, and they're not important to the New Testament, but we'll have to talk about them a little bit. Now, during this century, when the Hasmonean kings are ruling with senatorial Rome kind of giving general protection to them from afar, they generally persecute the faithful in Israel. That happens over and over again. And they're bad kings. If you thought that Antiochus Epiphanes was bad, you haven't met bad until you meet the Jewish kings who came after him. And finally, there was a civil war that broke out between two Hasmonean claimants to the throne, and the Jews invited the senatorial Rome to come in and settle matters. And so they sent General Pompey in, and Pompey arrived in 63 BC to settle affairs in Judea. Okay, and he did so. First of all, he tried to work it out with the Jews, but they just continued to fight with each other right under his nose. And so he went over to the land of Idumea, which the Old Testament calls Edom, and he pulled over their king and said, I'll put you in charge. That way, neither one of these Jewish parties can be in charge, and everybody can hate you instead of hating each other. It's just good policy, you know. You got two people at war with each other, give them a third party to hate, and then they can join together hating him. So he put Antipater of Idumea in charge, and everybody hated him. And his son was Herod the Great. So now we've come to the New Testament. That's where we are. Clear? We'll do all this again next week, word for word. Okay. Then eventually you'll get it. At least it's written down here for you because I provide handouts. Yes.
How do you know that the Day of Atonement was not yet?
Well, I'm sure they went through the motions, but there's no high priest to do it. I think that's probably important that Jesus never is seen going to it in the Gospels. You had to have a true Zadokite high priest to do it, and they didn't have them. So, yeah, I'm sure they went through the motions. You see, you've got a problem. Here's the temple. Let's just talk about this. Let's anticipate what we'll get to 6 weeks from now. Okay, here's the Holy of Holies, and here's the holy place, and here's the altar, and here's your temple. All right? The only person who's allowed to go in the Holy of Holies is the high priest. And there's only one ritual that only the high priest can do, and that's the ritual of the Day of Atonement. Once a year, he goes into the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, and sprinkles blood in front of the mercy seat. That has to be done by the high priest. If you got a false high priest, that's not going to be done. But they can go in there and go through the motions, but God doesn't count it. Now, all the other things that go on can be done by ordinary priests. Now, after the temple is restored from the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, this is the situation. Now, there are 3 ways you can look at this. How do we respond to this? Okay? One group said, well, if there's no true high priest, then this whole system is bad. It's all defiled. So we won't have anything to do with it. What were they called? The Essenes. There was another group that said, hey, there's nothing wrong with this. Doesn't matter who's high priest. It's all fine. What are they called? Sadducees. And there was another group that split the difference. Now, I don't know that I don't have any literature to show this, but essentially, in essence, this is what they thought. This is still an operation, but we don't really have a true high priest. And that's why we're not Sadducees, we're... Okay? That help you any? It helps me. Any other quick questions about this history? Yes, sir? No, there's no Ark of the Covenant. It did not come back from. When Pompey took over in 63 BC, Pompey thought he'd take a look inside the temple. Why not? He'd been inside every other temple there was that he'd ever been around. And he'd heard a lot about this, you know. The Jews were known around the ancient world. They were special, they were weird, they were different. There's a lot of fun stuff you can read about that. Juvenal, Roman satirist, has a satire on the Jews. It's very funny to read. You see what the Romans thought of the Jews by reading it. So he was very interested, and they told him he couldn't go in, but he busted in there anyway, and there was nothing inside here. Okay, the Holy of Holies was empty. Which he thought, this is weird. But actually Pompey was pretty nice about it. He went in and looked around, and there was plenty of gold in there, but he left it in there. He wasn't out to exploit or defile the Jews. He was just there to settle things. The Romans wanted peace. The peace of Edom, the peace of Israel, the peace of Spain. But basically they wanted peace. Pax Romana, Roman peace, P-A-X, Pax, peace. That's what they were about. So they weren't really out to just exploit everybody and take it all away. They just wanted everything peaceful so they could run it. Now, the first thing in terms of the literature of this period we need to talk about is the Septuagint, or as it says here, LXX. That's Roman numeral for 70. And when you see the Septuagint quoted in literature, you'll see LXX. It's a lot simpler to type that in than to type in Septuagint. It's called that because, according to the myth, 70 scholars wrote it. Okay? Now, how did this come about? Well, remember that there are Jews in Egypt, and we have literature from the Jews in Egypt. They went down there in the days of Jeremiah, and by the 1st century A.D., there was over 1 million of them. So there was lots and lots of Jews in Egypt during this time. We have, among the stuff that we find in Egypt, an earlier version of the book of Jeremiah, for instance. It's about 3/4 as long as our Jeremiah, and it's organized differently. It's got things in different order. We wonder, where does this come from? Well, if you read the book of Jeremiah, you'll see that Jeremiah actually wrote a bunch of prophecies up at one point and gave them to the king, and the king threw them in the fire, and he wrote them up again. So there's a first edition of Jeremiah right there. And it's likely that there were other collections that he and Baruch put together before they made the final version that we have. And we have one of these earlier versions from Egypt. It's interesting, but it's not the canonical text. But that's one thing we have from these Jews in Egypt that scholars look at. If you were going to write a commentary on Jeremiah, you'd have to take it up a little bit. Another group of writings we have are called the Elephantine Papyri. This was the first version of what is now called the Adventures of Babar the Elephant. Elephantine, no it's not. Okay, here's Egypt. All right, here's the Nile. And if you go on down the Nile, eventually you come to a place where there are rapids as the river tumbles down from higher ground. Okay, and the first one of these you come to is called the First Cataract. Okay, if you're in a boat, you have to take the boat out of the water and carry it up the hill and get it back in the river on the other side of this cataract. So you put a fortress here. And there's a fortress there, and the place is called Elephantine. Elephantine in English, or Elephantine. And there was a garrison of Jewish mercenaries there. And as a result, a large settlement of Jews. Okay, Jewish mercenary soldiers. And these people had their own temple, and the temple was for Yahweh, but they also had parts of the temple for Baal and Asherah and lots of other gods as well. They had definitely fallen into a false and what we call syncretistic religion. The word syncretism, if you look at the word syncretism, it's writing down there. Let's see if I can write it up here. Syncretism. What does cre mean? Credo, belief. Okay, and what does sin mean? With or together. Okay, a mixture of belief. Syncretism. With belief. Mixture of belief. Mixture of commitments. Credo means I commit myself. I put my trust in, I believe. So, that's the kind of religion they had. They were still Jews, and we have letters and material from them that tells us something about their situation. It's not of great interest to us studying the Bible, but there you are, there's this. Now, meanwhile, there's another city that's important, and that's Alexandria, which Alexander the Great had taken from a little town and made into a big place, and now it was a big place. And in Alexandria, there was a famous library, and the librarians at Alexandria had a policy of wanting every book that had ever been written to be in their library. So, one of the things they would naturally want is the holy books of the Jews. And so, the legend is that the library commissioned the Jews to produce a translation of their holy books, and that it was miraculously completed in 72 days. Several different scholars were given to translate it, and each one of them made his own translation. At the end of the 72 days, they compared them, and they were word for word the same. How amazing. Well, we know this from a writing called the Letter of Aristeas. Aristeas tells us this story. But nobody believes it. The likely truth is that it was translated by various men over time for the Jewish community. And they may have put copies in the Alexandrian library, but the Jews themselves had lost the ability to speak Hebrew. They'd already lost the ability to speak Hebrew in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's why when Ezra spoke, the Levites had to translate what he said into what language? Aramaic, so the people could understand it. That's in the book of Ezra. Well, by this time, down in Greek Egypt, everybody spoke Greek. They didn't speak Hebrew anymore, so they just needed it. This was probably done around 250 BC. Now, what's the importance of this Greek translation of the Old Testament? Well, first of all, it helps us to understand some New Testament words and how they correspond to Old Testament Hebrew words. Okay, so if you're reading the New Testament and you come to the word hilasterion, and you say, what does that mean? Does it mean mercy seat? Does it mean propitiate? Does it mean expiate? That's all real clear, isn't it? What's the difference between propitiate and expiate? I mean, it's clear as mud, right? But you see, we scholars worry about this. Does it mean propitiate or expiate or mercy seat or what? Well, you can look back at the Septuagint and see how the Old Testament was translated into Greek, and you can start getting clues as to how Paul might be using the word hilasterion out of that background. Doesn't answer everything, though, because you still just have to reflect on how the equivalent word is used in Hebrew in the Bible. And it kind of means all those things, but we're not going to go into that. Another importance of the Septuagint is that some New Testament writers seem to quote from it. Not all. Sometimes you get the idea, well, the New Testament's written in Greek, so whenever they quote from the Old Testament, they're quoting from this Greek translation. No, some do and some don't. Some of the writers make their own translations. But nobody actually ever in the New Testament simply quotes the Old Testament the way we do. When we quote something, we put it off in blocks and we make sure it's word for word the same. Whenever the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it is referring to a particular place in the Old Testament, and very frequently the translation will make some changes in precisely what you find in the Old Testament. Because he's making a general point and referring to the Old Testament, he's not providing an Old Testament proof text, word for word. You have to bear that in mind. So even though some of the writers use the Septuagint version in what they quote, that doesn't put an imprimatur, a seal of approval on the Septuagint so that we should be using that instead of the Hebrew Bible. It's just that they used whatever was convenient. And if the Septuagint used the words they wanted to use, they used that. If it didn't, they made their own translation. Guys like me do the same thing. When I'm writing on the Old Testament, if the New American Standard says what I think is good enough, I just quote it. If it doesn't, and I look at the Hebrew and say, no, I want something more precise, I make my own. That's what the writers of the New Testament did. I'm just like them. I'm just like the apostles. Bear that in mind.
The accuracy of in your thought of the Hebrew Masoretic text and the Greek Septuagint in your thought is one.
How accurate is the Septuagint? I believe that the Masoretic text as we have it is the accurate text. It stands up to scrutiny in terms of outlining word counts and other things. But I wasn't going to talk at length about the Septuagint, but it is not all that accurate. In fact, I believe that mistakes were written into the Septuagint as a signal to knowledgeable Jews that this is not the same as the Word of God. Some versions of it have Methuselah living through the flood. The book of Job, when Job's wife says, curse God and die in the Septuagint, she has a whole lot more to say than that. She really lets him have it. And I think this was a signal to the Jews that, well, this is not the Word of God, this is a version of it, because God has not told us we can translate it. When did God tell us that we could translate the Old Testament? That's what the gift of tongues means in the New Testament. That now the Word can go in every language. That's why on the day of Pentecost you hear it in all these other languages. But up until that time they had no authorization to translate it. The official copy was kept locked up in the Holy of Holies and nobody was supposed to go in there. They did have copies and they could use it, but the way it was supposed to be used is you read it out loud in Hebrew and then you give the sense in some other language. But you don't actually translate the text. Where do we see that today? What religion in the world today is that same way? Islam. In Islam, it is forbidden to translate the Quran into another language. It's been done, but it's forbidden. Now, I don't know that it was actually forbidden, but the Jews would have thought, God hasn't told us we can translate this, so we'll make a version of it, but we'll put some signals in to indicate that this is not. That's what I believe. Some people might dispute that. Well, the Septuagint is also important because the early church, with the destruction of the Jews in AD 70, knowledge of Hebrew just pretty much evaporated in the early church, which was in Greek and Roman society, all speaking Greek. And so for 2 or 3 centuries, the Old Testament that was used by the church is the Septuagint. That is the version that Augustine uses. It includes the Apocrypha. So Augustine thinks that the Apocrypha is part of the Word of God. Warts and all, they are using the Septuagint. The first person to translate from the Hebrew into Latin was who? Jerome. Okay, one of the 4 doctors of the church. Jerome, weirdo, went off to Palestine, learned Hebrew, and translated. You know, he was just one of these guys who could sit there all day long and live on nothing and just work in books and never bathe, and you wouldn't want to be around him, but he got it done, okay? He got it done, the first translation from Hebrew into Latin, and that's called the Vulgate translation. And after he'd done it, nobody liked it, because they were all used to the earlier Latin translation that was made from the Septuagint. Augustine didn't like it at all. But there it was, and so finally that happened. But for a long time, the Septuagint was the Bible, and because of that, it set certain things in motion, okay? The Apocrypha is included in the Septuagint. As we'll see in a moment, the Jews knew it wasn't inspired, but it was included in there, and so the church kind of kept it along. And the Septuagint numbers the Psalms differently. And Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Bibles follow that numbering to this day. So if you pick up a Catholic Bible, the Psalms are not numbered the same way. You get confused. Psalm 130 in our Bible is Psalm 129 in the Catholic Bible. So if you go to a record store and it says Bach cantata on Psalm 130, that's Psalm 130, because Bach is a Lutheran. But if it says Lalonde, a French composer, cantata on Psalm 129, that's the same psalm, because he's a Catholic composer. This is important information. Make sure you know that. So this is some of the things that we can say about the Septuagint, and that's enough. Boring. Now we come to the Apocrypha. It's a lot more fun. Anybody in this room named Susan, or Susanna, or Suzanne? Okay. Well, you know where your name comes from? I didn't think so. Well, once upon a time, there was, in the city of Babylon, a Jewish elder named Joachim. And he had a beautiful young wife named Susanna. And he was a wealthy man. And he had a nice house. And he was very wise. He had a garden next to his house. And every day, Susanna would go out and walk in her nice garden that her husband had for her. Well, one year, a couple of really sleazy, dirty old men were made elders of the Jewish community in Babylon. And since Joachim was an important man, they would go to his house to consult with him and get his ideas on things before they would do things on their own. And they noticed beautiful Susanna. And each man thought to himself, I would like to commit adultery with her. But they didn't do anything about it. But they used to hang around Joachim's house a lot, seeking advice, because they got to see Susanna there. Well, one day, they were really overcome with desire, and on their way out, both of them said, I think I'm just going to have to go on home now. So they both went home, and they both doubled back, and they both met at the house, and then they discovered that both of them were interested in Susanna. Well, one day they hid in Susanna's garden, and Susanna came out to bathe in the garden. That sound familiar? Okay. Sound like maybe Bathsheba? Well, then they both appear, and they say, you must commit adultery with us, or else we're going to... And she says, no, I won't. And they said, well, if you don't, we'll just accuse you of committing adultery with some young man. We'll tell the whole story, and we'll get you in trouble, and you'll be put to death. And she said, well, I'm not going to sin and do this with you. And so they made a big yell, and all the people came together, and the court sat, and they said, we came into the garden, and Susanna was in the arms of this young man, and he ran away before we could see who he is. But both of us, testimony of 2 witnesses, elders of the community, promise you that Susanna has committed adultery. And so the judges decide to put Susanna to death. And she prays to God, and God hears her, and God sends Daniel, who's just a young man. And Daniel shows up and says, hey, you can't put her to death. She's innocent. And the judges say, well, how do you know? He says, well, I'll tell you what. Let's just interview each one of those elders separately. So they send one of the dirty old men elders out, and they ask the first one. Daniel says, under what tree was Susanna committing adultery when you saw her in the arms of this young man? And he says, it was under a mastic tree. And Daniel says, all right, you leave. And they called the other elder in and asked him the same question, and he said it was under an oak tree. So now they knew that these two elders were lying, and they were both put to death, and Susanna and Joachim lived happily ever after. Okay? That's the story of Daniel and Susanna. That's the story from the Apocrypha. That's where your name comes from. Now, what does it mean? This is a story from this intertestamental period time, when you've got bad religious leaders. I mean, you've got preachers who do this kind of thing today. Ever seen the apostle? Remember what he likes to do when he's not behaving himself? Here you have a couple of dirty old men elders, maybe Sadducees, and maybe the loyal, righteous Pharisee party doesn't want to go along with that, but they just want to exploit the people and take advantage. And so we have a story that talks about wisdom and avoiding the oppression of wicked religious leaders. And how do you do it? You listen to the prophets. Okay, that's what it means. You listen to guys like Daniel. You listen to the prophets, do what they say, and you'll get through it all right. When they attack you, when they attack the innocent bride of Yahweh, the daughter of God. Joachim is the name of the high priest, and his wife, Susanna, is a symbol for Israel, for the true faithful church. And when they're attacked by evil religious leaders, then you should cry to God, follow the prophets, Daniel, and God will vindicate you in time. That's the message here. Okay? That's why the story is worth hearing. It's an allegory. It's also just kind of a lot of fun. Well, that's an Apocrypha. What is the Apocrypha? What we mean by this word are writings that were deemed of enough spiritual importance to be included in the Septuagint. They weren't inspired, and the Jews always knew they weren't inspired. We have lists of true inspired books from the Jews that tell us which ones were real inspired books and which ones weren't. But they were regarded as good spiritual literature, edifying and worth including together with the Bible. The church used these books in a general way as partly authoritative until the time of the Reformation. Partly that's because they came in with the Septuagint. Partly it's because if you read these books, you'll find they're chock full of good wisdom. Okay? So why toss them out? They had a kind of a secondary status, not at the same level as the Bible. However, there are phrases in certain parts of the Apocrypha that can be used to defend wrong doctrine. There are phrases that you can use to say, well, it's okay to pray for the dead. There are other phrases that you can use to indicate other things that the Roman Catholic Church was teaching at this time. And so Luther tossed out the Apocrypha, and the other reformers followed him. The Reformation Bibles took the Apocrypha and put them all together as a separate group and published them between the Testaments. I should have said earlier that Bibles before that time and Catholic Bibles today have the apocryphal books sandwiched in the Old Testament at different places. Protestant Bibles took all of them together and made them kind of a middle section. You finish the Old Testament, then you got the Apocrypha, then you got the New Testament. That's something the Protestants did, and all early Protestant Bibles have it, including the King James. Then eventually it was dropped out altogether. Rome reacted by declaring the apocryphal books fully authoritative, but it called them deuterocanonical, which means of secondary status. They are authoritative and they're inspired, but they're still kind of secondary compared to the rest of the books. And that's where we are today. Well, because Rome does that, we don't want anything to do with the Apocrypha. But the fact is, it's mostly very good pre-Christian religious literature. Okay? You read Christian fantasy stories by C.S. Lewis or Tolkien or whatever. You read books on how to have a happy marriage. You read theological books. You read books of history. Well, that's what's in here. Okay? As we survey it next week, we'll see some of the things that are in here. And at some point in your life, and certainly Christian schools ought to, I don't know why this is ignored. It's some of the most important literature. If you go to art museums, you're going to see paintings of Susanna and the elders. Because after all, she's taking a bath in the garden, right? Like Bathsheba. I mean, artists like to paint women taking baths. So it makes a great subject. Other stories you'll see paintings of too. You'll see allusions to these things. It should be part of our general knowledge and background. So, I've got down here the Oxford Annotated Apocrypha, Revised Standard Version, Expanded Edition, which is probably about as good as you can get. If you want one, order that or find it. It has all the books plus a few others. Before we close, what are some of the things we find? Well, we find edifying fiction. I've told you the story of Susanna and Daniel. Next week, I'll tell you how to pop a dragon. If you want to learn how to pop a dragon, it's in the Septuagint. If you would like to learn how to heal blind people and drive demons away using a fish, you'll find that secret also in the Apocrypha. Okay? Then there are historical works, or works that pretend to be historical, like the Prayer of Manasseh, the book of Baruch. Who's Baruch in the Bible? Jeremiah's assistant, okay? Well, this is a book supposedly by him. There's a letter of Jeremiah. There's a book that's called First Esdras or Third Ezra, and then there are additions to Esther. And we have historical propaganda like First, Second, and Third Maccabees. We have philosophy like Fourth Maccabees. We have wisdom. Wisdom of Solomon and the wisdom of Ben Sirach or Ecclesiasticus. And we have apocalyptic, Second Esdras or Fourth Ezra, and we have hymns. The Prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Children. We will look at some of those things. We'll look at all those things next week. So save these notes, okay? Because we're only beginning to get through. Any question real quick before we stop? Thanks.
Paul refers to Abraham having been promised to the heir of the world. So it's kind of about the initial Testament prophet where God promised him the land of the sea. And Paul suggests that he was promised to the heir of the world. What is he referring to there? Something different?
I think Paul is referring to the fact that Abraham was told that he would be the father of many nations. And that refers to spiritual parentage. The world would become his through all the people who converted to the faith of Abraham. Joseph says of the Egyptians, God has made me a father to Pharaoh. So at that point, Abraham is the father of the Egyptians. All nations that convert have Abraham as their father, and in that sense he inherits the world. I don't think that Paul is there referring to specific areas on a map in terms of geography of what was promised to Abraham. Okay.
In the Book of Common Prayer, you see references as well to apocryphal books like Tobit, whatnot.
Yeah.
Also hold it to be inspired.
No.
Secondarily.
If you read the 39 articles of the Episcopal Church, it says the Apocrypha is not Scripture, but it is to be read in the church as edifying literature. So there are prescribed readings, semi-prescribed readings from Ecclesiasticus, Tobit, and the like, which, from the edifying parts.